Welcome back. All right, yeah, I want to talk about Buffalo today, and I figured I would go with the Buffalo Slug jersey and hat. The interesting thing is, as much as people didn't like these jerseys and were glad when they went back to that logo and look, they did well with these, actually. Their record when they had these wasn't bad. But at any rate, their current record, not great. 10-13-2 overall. They are 5 points out of a playoff spot. And again, when you're 4 or more points out of a playoff spot, even though it is quite early, comparatively speaking, with an 82-game schedule, we are 25 games in. It can be tough to make up that distance. Last year, at this point, they were 11-13-1, so they're actually 1 point off of last year's pace. Now, last year they ended 42-33-7, and their record beyond this point was 31-20-6. And there was reason to be optimistic. If you're a Buffalo fan, looking at last year and looking at how it ended, there was a reason to be optimistic coming into the season that maybe that playoff drought extending back to 2011, the last time they made the playoffs, that it could be over this year. 2021-2022, they were 8-14-3 on this at this point, so 25 games into the season. They ended 32-39-11, which was 24-25-8 after this point 2 years ago. So it's tough. It's tough to make the playoffs. They went 11 games above 500 after the 25-game mark last year, which is not bad, but it was not enough to make the playoffs. They finished 1 point short. And this is where those games early in the season are important, right? So when we look at their goals scored per game, 2021, 2022, and then last season, 2022, 2023, and this season, 2021, 2022, 2.79 goals scored per game, which is a little bit below where they are right now, 2.84. So the troubling part is their goal scoring and goals against are not really far off of where they were 2 seasons ago. They were allowing 3.5 goals per game 2 years ago, and right now it's 3.4. So not a huge difference, and not trending in the direction they were last year, where they scored 3.57 goals per game and allowed 3.62 goals against per game. So they weren't quite even in goals for and goals against, but their attack was very good. And it was one thing that was great about watching their games last year was no matter what happened, it was very entertaining. This year, far less entertaining. I have not been talking about how entertained I am by Buffalo games. I'm more troubled and perplexed than anything. So, their power play has fallen off. It was 21.2% 2 years ago, 23.4% last year, and this year 14.1%. And we'll get into maybe why. We'll get into who very well, maybe part of the reason why. There's a few different players to talk about there. The penalty kill, actually the best it's been over the 3-year period. It was 76.4% 2 years ago, 73% last year, and this year 81.5%. So, if they could bring their power play up without sacrificing anything on the penalty kill, they should overall get better. But again, now that we're 25 games into the season, it gets very difficult to make the necessary improvements and take those jumps up the standings, right? So when we look at their scoring by period, the first period was a problem 2 years ago. They allowed 84 goals. They've scored 62. Last year, they allowed 82. They scored 81. So that was a lot closer. Well, this year, they've regressed. They've scored 19 and they've allowed 34. So they're on pace for a worse season than they had 2 years ago. Second period, 2 years ago, allowed 103 goals, scored 93, so that's a difference of -10. Last year, they allowed 101, they scored 100, so a difference of -1. This year, they've allowed 27, they scored 23, that's a difference of -4. So again, they're on pace to be worse than that -10 from 2 years ago. Then you look at the third period, they were a -22 2 years ago, scoring 70 and allowing 92. Last year, they scored 103 and allowed 110, so that's a -7. And this year, they've scored 28 and allowed 27. So they're actually a positive, a +1. The one instance in a first, second, or third period where they've had a positive differential. So at least in the third period, there's a positive there. And then in overtime, they were a -4 2 seasons ago, allowing 8, scoring 4 times. Last year, they scored 9 times, allowed 4, so that's a +5. And this year, they've scored once, they've allowed 2, so they're a -1 there. So their third period has been good, so that's a positive, but everything else shows regression across the board. And then the question has to be asked about Don Granato. Now, it feels like with Don Granato, he's not the problem. The thing is, we've already seen an instance where or 2 instances maybe, right, whether you agreed with the coaching changes for Edmonton or Minnesota, there weren't a lot of people who were calling for those coaches to be fired. They're like, yeah, Woodcroft's the problem, Evason's the problem. So in the end, the general manager may very well make a change at coach, just trying to turn things around. It doesn't necessarily reflect on whether or not the coach is doing a good job. So is Don Granato's job safe? I would say it probably should be, but I would have said the same with Minnesota and Edmonton. So looking at scoring last year and this year so far, Tage Thompson really stands out, doesn't he? Last year, 47 goals, 47 assists, 94 points in 78 games. There was real talk of him being the tallest 50-goal scorer in NHL history, and coming into this year that he was going to get there. And I thought, after last season, he had proven his contract was a bargain. This year, when he's played, a bit more of an issue. 19 games, 6 goals, 6 assists, 12 points. Not terrible totals, but definitely not in line with last year. So you have that big drop-off, and Tage Thompson was a big part of the reason why that power play last year was so good. Jeff Skinner last year, 35 goals, 47 assists, 82 points in 79 games. This year, 10 goals, 8 assists, 18 points in 25 games. So he's on pace for about 55 to 60 points this year, which is not awful. But again, when you had 82 points last year, it is a big drop-off for Skinner. Tuck is due for a drop-off as well. 36 goals, 43 assists, 79 points in 74 games this season so far. 8 goals, 9 assists, 17 points in 20 games. So again, we've seen a drop-off with Tuck, which was predictable, but has anybody really jumped up to get that scoring going? Well, the problem is there's others that have dropped off as well. So Rasmus Dahlin, 78 games last year, 15 goals, 58 assists, 73 points. This year, 25 games played, 5 goals, 15 assists, 20 points. So if he gets 20 points every 25 games, that's 60 points in 75 games. So right around a 65-point pace, which again, for a defenseman is very good, but it's off of last year's pace. So almost everybody in Buffalo, their scoring has dropped off at least a bit. And so it's a matter of where does that offense come from? Dylan Cousins might be the most dramatic drop-off on the board. 81 games, 31 goals, 37 assists, 68 points last year. Great run. This year, 23 games, 4 goals, 7 assists, 11 points. So not that upward trajectory that we expected coming into this year. It seems late for a sophomore slump, but here we are. Young player going through a rough season. I do believe Cousins, as young as he is going to be able to overcome this, but that scoring drop-off is alarming, right? Then you get to Middlestad, who honestly, his numbers are better this year than last year. Last year, 82 games, 15 goals, 44 assists, 59 points. This year, 25 games, 5 goals, 16 assists, 21 points. So he's on pace to eclipse last year's totals. But again, do they have enough goals from Middlestad to make up for the goals from everybody else? I would say no. That's not Middlestad's game anyways. It's the passing game. But you need more goals, which brings us to Victor Olofsson. Olofsson not in the lineup every night, and Olofsson not scoring like he did last year. In 75 games last season, 28 goals, 12 assists, 40 points. This year, 19 games, 3 goals, 7 assists, 10 points. So again, Olofsson's dropped off. Tuck's dropped off. Cousins, Thompson, who's out of the lineup injured, right? Skinner dropped off as well. A lot of players here who had really good seasons last year offensively, and so now you can see why the goal scoring's dropped off by about 0.7 goals per game. And then you've got Jack Quinn. Last year, 75 games, 14 goals, 23 assists for 37 points. I can add, I swear I can add that that's a talent that I have. It just doesn't show up there. So, or I'll just blame it on the entertainment guy. Sure, we'll do that. But this year, of course, Quinn's been injured. He hasn't played yet. Now, is it Quinn's fault that this team's in the situation they're in? No, absolutely not. I don't think that if Quinn was in the lineup, we would see a lot more wins for them. So I wouldn't say that his injury explains everything, but has anybody made up those 14 goals? No. So then you've got Owen Power, 79 games last year, 4 goals, 31 assists, 35 points. Signed an expensive contract. So far this year, 25 games, 1 goal, 11 assists, 12 points. I think Power's played well. He's a young defenseman. So defensemen don't necessarily become megastars overnight. Not everybody comes in and does the Cale Makar thing or the Adam Fox thing. For some defensemen, it can take them a little bit longer to get those points totals up and become really, Norris level. But for Power, I think he's been good. It's just a matter of if Power and Dahlin are the guys. They're kind of young. I think that's why they brought in Clifton. A little bit of toughness, a little bit of experience. Peterka. Peterka's been a good story on a team that needs it. 77 games last year, 12 goals, 20 assists, 32 points. This year in 25 games, 10 goals, 8 assists, 18 points. So what's interesting is Peterka's on pace for more than 30 goals, which obliterates last year's 12. So we can talk about how well Peterka's playing. Skinner has 10 goals. He's on pace for over 30 goals as well, but his points per game have dropped off. So it shows how two players can put up the same amount of points and play the same. One's seen as kind of a breakthrough and the other one's seen as kind of a step back. And then you get into the goaltending. The goaltending gets mentioned a lot with Buffalo. And it is something that maybe they should have addressed more in the offseason than they did by basically saying, well, we're going to go with Levi, Luukkonen and Comrie and see who emerges. Last year, Luukkonen 17, 11, and 4, 891 save percentage. This year, he's 6-5-1 with a 907 save percentage. I think Luukkonen's played well. Craig Anderson last year, 11, 11, and 2, 908 save percentage. And of course, Craig Anderson retired. So I do think they missed that. Notice Anderson's numbers, the best of the goalies from last year. Comrie was 9, 9, and 1 last season with an 886 save percentage. This year, he's 1 and 4 with an 864 save percentage. So the argument that the goaltending hasn't been good enough, it definitely adds up here. Levi last season, 5 and 2, 905 save percentage. A lot of excitement. I felt kind of bad with Levi for that because it can be tough for a young goalie coming in, especially as, and I've talked about this before, that teams will kind of get a book on a goaltender and then the goaltender's got to adjust to that. So this year for Levi, 3-4-1 record, 876 save percentage. So big drop off for Levi, and they need him to get his game back, but it does feel like this is a team that if Hellebuyck had been on the trade block instead of being signed by the Jets, this would have been a spot where Hellebuyck would have been, I think, most useful. I look at the goals against for this team being at 3.4, last year 3.6, the year before 3.5. And while we can talk about the defense, and definitely the blue line hasn't been quite good enough, the goaltending as well, they haven't had that starter that can really take things over. So one thing I don't have on the board, obviously the coach I talked about earlier, Don Granato. I also don't have Kevin Adams on the board as the GM. I don't think Kevin Adams is in any kind of trouble at this point because there's a lot of just regression we're seeing across the board from players. I do feel like this is going to be something that maybe ends up getting reflected on the coach. So it does feel like that's what will happen. I don't think Adams' job is in any kind of danger right now. So when we look at their upcoming schedule, because they have to turn this around, I wanted to have all of the month of December on here that they haven't played yet. So Thursday, they're in Boston. In Boston. I'll learn to say Boston. I can say Boston. Look at me. You can't say Boston either. But yeah, Thursday, December 7th, they're in Boston. Not an easy place to go. The Boston Bruins have had their rough patch. It feels like there was that six-game streak there where they weren't very good. They've come through that somewhat, although of the 3 wins, one against Columbus, one against San Jose, you kind of have to take those with a grain of salt. But then wouldn't you say the same of Buffalo? So now Buffalo's in the position where they're kind of the also-ran, which means they get the backup goalie, which would be Ullmark, who, of course, against Buffalo, Ullmark's kind of motivated. Then on Saturday, they're at home against the Montreal Canadiens. Montreal, again, showing last night against Seattle. They can win their share of games. Montreal's not going away. They may not be a contender. They may not end up in the playoffs, but Montreal's capable of winning their share of games. Then on Monday, they're at home against the Arizona Coyotes, so on December 11th. Wednesday, they're in Denver, and that's going to be tough because the Avalanche, pretty good team. So it is not an easy run, especially considering the way the Coyotes have been playing lately too, right? Then on Friday, they're in Vegas. So you go from Colorado to Vegas on the Friday, and then the next night they're in Arizona. So that's 3 games and 4 nights. Colorado, Vegas, Arizona. All 3 teams, pretty solid records. All 3 teams playing well enough that Buffalo's going to have to bring their A game to beat them. Then they come back home on December 19th and play against the Columbus Blue Jackets. And on Thursday that week, they host the Toronto Maple Leafs. So, again, it's not an easy schedule. Columbus has showed lately that they absolutely can stay in games. They can win their share of games as well. On the Saturday, then, they're in New York against the Rangers before they come back home. And on that Wednesday, December 27th, so 20 days apart, they meet Boston again. Now, they're in Boston on the 7th, and on the 27th, they're at home against Boston. And then on the Saturday following that, they're at home against Columbus. So that's twice they host Columbus before the next night going to Ottawa and playing the Senators. The Senators and the Sabres were supposed to be, battling it out to see which one of them might end up being the wild card this year. That was the expectation, was that between Detroit, Ottawa, and Buffalo, these three teams should be fighting it out. But that matchup at the end of this month looks like it could be for, who's sixth in the division, right? This is going to be a very busy month, though, for Ottawa. That will be their 15th game in the month of December. Maybe they're tired by then. But if Buffalo's record between now and that game isn't really strong, it may not make much of a difference. So it's not at the point where I think, if you're a Sabres fan, well, you give up on this season. The problem is when your team hasn't made the playoffs since 2011, your fan base is going to tune out relatively easily. And we've seen a lot of empty seats in Buffalo. I don't talk about it because I get it. I absolutely get it. And last year I was saying, nope, Buffalo fans, this team looks like it's going to be different. They're exciting. They're fun to watch. This is a team, a lot of good young players and all the chemistry and everything's working really well. I haven't been saying that this year because it just hasn't felt the same. The Buffalo Sabres feel completely different. And it is one of the reasons why I love covering hockey, and I've loved sports for as long as I have, because you can have a team that's playing really, really well in April, right up until April, and then the season ends. You're like, all right, well, we didn't make the playoffs. We were playing well. You have almost the exact same roster 6 months later, and a completely different result. And it just doesn't work. And then we're here debating it as we are here. It is just fascinating to me how sports works like that. That you can have a roster that is largely the same and have a completely different result. So I guess the question I have for Buffalo fans watching this is, if you're still watching this at this point as a Buffalo fan, bravo. I mean that because I really want this to not feel like it's just time to pile on Buffalo. But it has been a rough 25 games. And again, it's not saying necessarily like, oh, playoffs or bust, but they were supposed to be better than this year. This is a disappointing result. And then the question becomes, is it on the GM? Is it on the coach? Or were those in the fandom and in the media who expected a turnaround just expecting too much from this roster? Maybe they were overrated coming into this season. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below, as always. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe if you're browsing your way through. You just happen upon this video or just because you feel like it. Thank you guys so much for watching, for all your support. I will talk to you again soon.